All right, I think that's covered. That's going to cover the board, and hopefully the microphone will pick up stuff, so at least we'll have a recording of the class for the people who are going to miss this on Zoom. All right. I had a lovely handout, which is on Moodle. So if you're able to access Moodle, I think I put it on Moodle before the internet went out. So if you can get that on your device, that would be great. If not, it'll be there for you after class. So. Okay, so what I wanted to do today was to kind of go backwards a little bit and talk about natural law, because we really only touched on that when we looked at the story of Christian ethics. I want to talk a little bit more about natural law, maybe hopefully clarify some things. This really comes out of my grading the next, not the most recent assignment, but the one before that, where I asked you to reflect on universality and particularity, reading Kant and Leo and Fletcher. He wanted to say Leo Fletcher, but I don't know if there's a person is Leo Fletcher, but Joseph Fletcher. So I want to talk about natural law, and then I want to go back to Rerum Novarum, which we read, I think, a couple of weeks ago, and talk about how that tries to bring the natural law tradition into the modern world. And then I want to look at MacIntyre's After Virtue, and sort of try to connect this to the narrative that he's telling, the persuasive narrative in Samuel Wells's Turn. So, what can you recall from our fragmentary discussions about natural law? Maybe just take a couple of minutes and write down all that you remember. Let's maybe imagine that someone has come up to you after church and has said to you, I hear you're studying Christian ethics. What can you tell me about natural law? What do you remember about natural law? What figures do we associate with natural law ethics? Okay, Thomas Aquinas, right? Okay. Catholic tradition. Okay, Roman Catholic ethics, strongly influenced by natural law. Yeah. Calvin, okay, there is something of a natural law tradition in Calvin, but Calvin is more often associated with divine command ethics. But certainly there are echoes of natural law in Calvin, especially when he talks about creation.
It's also associated with Aristotle.
Aristotle, okay, yeah. So natural law is it's not invented by Catholic theologians. In fact, Catholic theologians would say, well, that's in the Bible. But the phrase actually comes from the older Greek and Roman traditions. So the Greeks would talk about nature or physis, and the Romans would talk about law or ius. Right? So you put those things together and you get this idea of a natural law. Anything else that you remember about natural law?
That people are part of nature, so that if it happens in nature, that it should be fine for humans.
Right, so it addresses the question of what is the relationship between humans and nature. And remember we talked about a kind of a split in different understandings of natural law, whether you define the human in continuity with nature or whether you define the human in contrast to nature. Right, so then you look at what is distinctively human. What do humans do that polar bears don't, or microscopic creatures don't? Yeah, that would be contrast, right? And that usually has something to do in the tradition with reason. Humans have this capacity called reason. What else do you remember about natural law? Well, hopefully some light should be going on here. What else do you recall? Right?
From the idea of at least in Christian understanding, this idea of balance of the image of God and animal nature. So it's not entirely just
Right.
Animals do it, therefore we should do it.
Right.
It's that balance of their divine and physical.
Right. So yeah. So what constitutes the divine image in human beings?
The fact that there's like a natural order to things, so if you get what you deserve, because it's just how it is. It's natural.
Yeah, the idea of a natural order, and that could be understood in terms of retribution, right? You go against nature, you're going to pay the price, Well, situate natural law. This is how Thomas does it. We can situate natural law within four broad kinds of law. The first kind is the eternal law. Right? And that is what we might call the mind of God, the mind and the will of God. Okay? And the eternal law is really unknowable, except we can glimpse it in when we look at natural law, we can glimpse the mind of God. When we look at divine revelation, we can glimpse the mind of God. But it's pretty well unknowable except in glimpses. Right? And then we have human law, right, which are the laws that are made by humans. We could call that the civil law. Then over here is the natural law. Okay, and that's knowable through reason. And then we have over here what Thomas calls the divine law, which is knowable through revelation. So all of these are connected to each other. So the divine law is revealed, and it's revealed in Scripture and Jesus, right? The natural law also has its origin in God, in the divine law, in the mind of God. And it's knowable, as I said, by reason. And the evidence of natural law is something that we call conscience. Right? So all human beings, whether they are Christian or atheist or Muslim or Buddhist, they all have a conscience. And that conscience is something that God has placed in human beings to guide them in terms of living this life. So when we talk about human nature, well, it's just human nature. Usually fallible human nature. We're talking about natural law. And human law is supposed to apply the natural law, and if it's in a Christian context, the revealed law. So these are the four different kinds of law, right? The eternal law, the divine law, the natural law, and human law. And they're all interrelated in Thomas's thinking. Now, when it comes to maybe a contrast with someone like, say, Calvin, when you talk about, and this is sort of Roman Catholic ethics, Protestants would say, wait a minute here. Yeah, there's reason and conscience, but reason is fallen. And human conscience is perverted. And we can even see that even nature itself is fallen. So natural law is not going to help us to discern the will and the mind of God. What we need are clear divine commands from Scripture. Right? Roman Catholics would say, yes, there are divine commands in Scripture, 10 Commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not kill, all those kinds of things. But these are, in a sense, they are clarifications of the natural law, right? So they're not contradictory to the natural law. They clarify the natural law. And with regard to the teaching of Jesus, they actually complete the natural law. They bring the natural law to its fulfillment, but they also allow us to enter the realm of grace. Right? So if you remember when we talked about Christ above culture, nature and culture, and grace. Grace perfects nature, right? Grace sort of takes nature and elevates it, brings it up to God, right? So nature is good, right? But it's not good enough to get you to heaven. You need grace in order to bring you up into heaven. But that's not intended to diminish the significance of nature. Right? Because when we talk about grace, and we'll talk about this a bit more on Wednesday with the virtues, right? You've got the natural virtues, and you've got the supernatural virtues. And Aristotle is a perfectly good guide when it comes to the natural virtues, but you need revelation to talk about the supernatural virtues or the theological virtues, which are, does anybody remember those? If you've read ahead. Faith, hope, and love. Down here are things like justice, prudence, justice, prudence,
Benevolence, something like
it would be a virtue, not a cardinal. I don't think it's one of the cardinal virtues, because there's a distinction here between, the sort of regular virtues and the cardinal virtues. Remember that we had that discussion of the painting, right? School of Athens. Okay, we'll talk about all that on Wednesday. But right now, I want you to be able to situate natural law. And something that's really important in natural law is this thing that we might call teleology. What is teleology? Anyone know what teleology is or have an idea? It's the Greek word telos.
Yeah. Something, right?
The end or the purpose of something. So everything that is created by God has an end or a purpose or a goal, right? Just like the end of this key is to unlock my car and start the engine, right? So when I go to my car, put this in the door, open the car, start the engine, this key has fulfilled its purpose, right? So everything that God creates has a kind of a telos, right? It has a purpose. It has a nature which is fulfilled. And the whole of the natural law is a way of talking about the different things in creation and how they fulfill their nature. So teleology is this idea that everything has a purpose. So would you say this is deontological or consequential, this scheme? In what ways is it deontological and in what ways is it consequential? Great.
Well, it's kind of it's consequential in that the idea of the purpose or the end goal of something. It's not but out of that you can also I'd say it's consequential in that respect,
Right.
and that it's consequence of things that you end up with ends up kind of leaning more focusing towards the purpose. You can't really have a consequential argument for something unless you understand its purpose.
Right.
But at the same time, there's the deontological side of things. I think a lot of deontological arguments kind of end up being derived from a understanding of what, where your rules come from, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. These are in a deontological ethics. These are the rules that are yours by virtue of your being a creature, a reasonable creature, right? So it's both deontological and consequential, right? There's no kind of separation between deontological ethics and consequentialist ethics, right? Which is really important to recognize. So the separation between deontological and consequential is something that we meet in modernity, when natural law is either rejected or it's redefined in terms of laws of science. Okay. So, And of course, the primary precept of natural law is to always do the good and avoid the evil. Right? Do the good and avoid the evil. That's the primary precept. Of natural law. Do the good and avoid the evil. And ethics really is a guiding into how to discern the good that you are to do and how you are to discern the evil that you are to avoid. In a sense, we might say that natural law ethics is a school of what it means to be human in this world, this particular kind of world that we live in. Okay, so let's now go to Rerum Novarum. Okay, Rerum Novarum, the encyclical of Pope Leo XIII. So just write down what you can remember about Rerum Novarum from reading it. We didn't really discuss it much in class, but you did read it. So write down everything that you can remember, even if it's just, well, it was written by the Pope, late 19th century. What it's about, some of the things it talks about. You'll find it
Page 119.
Yeah, starts on page 119. Starts on page 119. So Rerum Novarum. Well, what's it about? Or what's the excerpt that you read about? Capital and labor. On capital and labor. So this is a response by Leo XIII to the Industrial Revolution. So at the beginning of the 19th century, you've got a very, very different kind of world in Europe compared to the end of the 19th century, right? And what makes the difference is this thing called the Industrial Revolution, right? It changes everything. It changes the structure of society. It changes society's understanding of wealth and labor, property, all of that kind of stuff. I mean, you could say that it's really, there are things, of course, before 1840 that anticipate the Industrial Revolution, ideas and so forth. But it's the Industrial Revolution really is the engine that sort of takes these ideas and sort of works them out in terms of what a society based on those ideas would look like. So the Industrial Revolution, and that creates a modern society that contrasts very much with the medieval society that we would associate with Christendom. And remember that natural law is, in a sense, natural law is sort of the dominant ethical paradigm within medieval society, right? And institutions, the institutions of medieval society, sort of have natural law as their basis, and the church as their guarantor. So, for example, in the medieval world, there was such a thing as a just price, right? What would be a just price for, let's say, a quart of barley? And ethicists would reason about what constituted a just price for a quart of barley. In our world, what's the price of a quart of barley?
Yeah, check the market.
Whatever people will pay, right? Whatever the market can set. And the market is free. There are no restrictions on the market. That's what capitalism is. So if the market dictates that a quart of barley costs $20, that's what it costs, right? Doesn't matter if that's just or not. No. You can't use the term justice to talk about the price of things, even if those things are necessities under capitalism, right? Another feature of the medieval society is a ban on usury. What's usury? What is usury? Interest, right? Lending money at interest. Using money to make money, right? And we say today, are you kidding me? You mean that there was a world in which you were not allowed to use money to make money? Right? A ban on usury. Well, why was usury banned? For the Bible tells me so, right? I mean, it's from the Old Testament, right? It's also really unjust because people get wealthy who don't labor, right? They don't work. They just let their money do the work for them. Another feature of medieval society were the guilds. If you were a carpenter, then you belonged to a carpenter's guild, right? It's sort of a community of by the way, this is where the Latin word is collegium. This is where the whole idea of a college comes from. And these guilds would not only regulate carpenters and whatever else, smiths and so forth, but they would also protect those carpenters and smiths and so forth, right? They were, in a sense, precursors of what today we would call labor unions in 2022. But going back to Leo XIII's time, there was no protection for workers, right? The union system was just beginning. And other things we could talk about as well. So what Leo is doing is he is, when he talks about the church and when he makes allusions to Christendom, he's talking about the kind of a society where you didn't have this great gulf between labor and capital, right? Now, he's not a socialist. He's very suspicious of socialism because by the 1870s, 1880s, socialism is associated with Marxism and atheism, right? So he says, we're not against profit, but we are against profit that exploits labor. Right, so he tries to have a balance when he talks about capital and labor. And you find this in Catholic social teaching. Balance is very important. Extremes are to be avoided. And that's because the natural world that we live in is a world of balance. Right? And he talks about institutions like the family. I mean, it's incredibly ironic to me when right-wing Christians sort of talk about the family. We have to protect family values. But they also unleash unfettered capitalism upon the world. The greatest threat to family values is capitalism. Right? The whole point of capitalism is to drive people out of their homes so they have to go to work to make money. Okay. So that's Leo's context. And so he talks about how natural law, or at least he alludes to the way that natural law puts limitations on growth, puts limitations on profit. Right? And the term that he uses there, of course, is the idea of the common good. Right? Yes, we can talk about private property and profits, but only insofar as they build common good, the good of the whole, right? Now, Leo can talk about this without bringing in the particular language of divine law and revelation. I mean, he does talk about revelation. He does talk about the way that natural virtue actually is not only good for this life, but it's also good for the life to come. But he is appealing to people simply on the basis of reason. Because we all have a common reason or a common sense of what is reasonable. So, is this not reasonable, Leo says? Now, 100 years later, after Leo, sorry.
I was just sort of curious. As I'm not very familiar with Catholic theology and stuff. My understanding is, the idea of Pope as the founder and the Orthodox and that sort of thing. Isn't that sort of an interesting both of kind of somewhat a level of revelation? If he is the one who's making these reasonable arguments?
Well, this is also, it's not only revealed in Scripture and Jesus, but we should also add the magisterium, right? The big structure of the church, But popes don't understand themselves as simply being conduits of divine law. They understand themselves as interpreting what's found in Scripture and in the teaching of Christ.
Okay.
And the Pope is only infallible when the Pope speaks ex cathedra. Right? So it's not like every word that comes out of the... So like if the Pope is... I don't know why this came to my mind, but maybe I should pause the video here. Okay. Let's say the Pope... let's say the Pope has a stomach ache. And he says, "Oh, my stomach." Right? That is not infallible. When the Pope says that. It's not like every word that comes out of the Pope's mouth is infallible. It's only when the Pope speaks, and we should really talk to Holly about this because as a Catholic, it's only when the Pope speaks as the vicar of St. Peter, right? "Upon this rock I will build my church," said Jesus. And the Pope effectively declares that something is the infallible teaching of the of the church and is not negotiable. Right? So I think Holly on Friday talked about priests can be married. That's not spoken ex cathedra. But women cannot be priests. That is spoken ex cathedra. Right? Because of the association. Remember what Ruther said, that in order to be the vicar of Christ, in order to stand in Jesus' place, you have to have gonads. Right? Male gonads. I think I got that right. Holly can correct me if I've got those back to front.
Yeah, you mentioned that in your other class.
Yes, 8.
So then you can't, like, let's say the Pope says something ex cathedra that's outlandishly out there. Can that be revised? Like, it says, like, you can only be saved on a Tuesday.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, I would want to say yes. I don't know if there are correctives within the magisteria that would contest that. But, seeing as the last 2 popes have been octogenarians, that would, they're over 80, old. That could be a question, I don't know. Benedict XVI was the first pope to retire. He was the first pope in history. I'm not 100% sure about that, but certainly the first pope in the modern age that has retired. Usually, you're in the seat until you die. So I want to kind of now fast forward to 1981, and a philosopher named Alistair MacIntyre. Okay, this is probably one of the most important books in philosophy, certainly in the last half century, after Virtue. This is the second edition that I have. And MacIntyre's an interesting fellow. There's a little bio of him in Wells. He starts out as an agnostic. He starts out as a Marxist philosopher. And he undergoes a conversion to Catholicism. So he is now probably, him and Charles Taylor would be like the 2 most prominent Christian philosophers in the world today. Charles Taylor, who taught for many, who's a Canadian, taught at McGill University. So the 2 of them. Anyway, this is a really important book. And what MacIntyre argues in the beginning of After Virtue is that we inhabit a moral world in fragments. He says, imagine that there has been a catastrophe, like let's say an environmental disaster in which the scientists are blamed, right? And in this catastrophe, virtually all scientific records and books are destroyed. In the next generation, people say, oh, but we need some science, we need to reconstruct. But all they have are fragments, all they have are pages that have been torn out from textbooks. All they have are random facts that they've uncovered, right? And the situation in moral philosophy is analogous to that. Maybe I have to put it slightly differently. Tom Holland's book Dominion, which came out a couple of years ago. Tom Holland, I've talked about him in other classes. Tom Holland was not a Christian. He was a writer of popular books on Greek and Roman history, kind of a popular historian. And he realized that the modern world was, for all intents and purposes, Christian. So when you contrast the modern world to the Roman world, and a lot of secular philosophers will say, oh yeah, we've got to get rid of all this Christian stuff and just go back to the values of classical Greece and Rome. And Holland argues, well, if you could be transported back to classical Greece and Rome, you would be shocked, because there'd be nothing like fundamental human rights, or the idea that love was a virtue to be emulated. All of those things come from Christianity. And even the very famous atheists like Richard Dawkins and so forth, Christopher Hitchens, they criticize Christianity, but they use Christian ideas and values to criticize Christianity. They just don't know it, or they refuse to see it. So for all intents and purposes, the heritage of modernity is Christian, but people don't know how to connect that with the larger tradition, right? So somebody talks about human rights. You can't invade Ukraine because Ukraine is a sovereign country. That's a violation of human rights. But push that. Where do these rights come from? What guarantees these rights? And then you find that there is really nothing, that is sort of fundamental or connected to the natural world, right? So McIntyre calls human rights useful fictions. At one point, in a bit of an overstatement, he says that human rights have no more existence than fairies and gnomes and so forth, right? So we know that it's wrong to invade other people's countries, but we no longer have a moral language that can explain why. Which is why some people are scared that, so if you look at it kind of, you captured a terrorist who's planted a bomb that's going to destroy a whole apartment building. The only way you can get information about where the bomb is planted is through torture. Before this happened, you would have said that it's a fundamental violation of human rights to torture somebody, but now you say, oh, well, we've got to torture the person, right? So moral incoherence, McIntyre would say. Moral incoherence. And this is rooted in what McIntyre calls the loss of teleology. We no longer believe that everything in the world, everything in nature, has an inherent purpose or goal. Thanks to the Enlightenment, we now say that the purpose of nature is whatever humans want it to be. Right? So we have, in a sense, cut off morality from the given, right? There are no limits. Everything is negotiable. And this creates a situation where McIntyre calls it emotivism. And emotivism is, there is no difference between saying X is wrong and I don't agree with X. Or, more subjectivistically, I don't like X. X is wrong, I don't like X. Murder is wrong because I don't like it. Adultery is wrong because I don't like it. Or I don't agree with it. Why don't you agree? I just don't agree with it. Right? Emotivism. I just don't like it. Now, McIntyre says everybody knows this, moral philosophers, right? But nobody wants to admit it. Except for one philosopher. His name is Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche. And Friedrich Nietzsche said, so what? I mean, we live in a world where God is dead. It's called nihilism. There is no meaning. There's no inherent meaning in the world, in nature, in creation, in human life. There is only the meaning that you impose upon it. So why not impose? What you call morality is nothing more than a will to power. And Nietzsche recognizes, he talks about the pale Galilean. Right? Nietzsche also recognizes that Christianity has made the modern world, and now we need to get rid of Christianity and go back to classical virtue. So, we might say the emperor has no clothes, and Nietzsche is you know the story. Nietzsche is the boy who says, hey, the emperor has no clothes, right? So Nietzsche is a very important philosopher for McIntyre and for John Milbank. You also read Milbank. Milbank has a slightly different take on how we got to be where we are now today in terms of morality. And whereas McIntyre wants us to, he wants that, the people who are left, the people who still have a memory of classical virtue, is sort of articulated by Aristotle and modified by Thomas. They should just get into these little communities, right? Communities of virtue where they preserve these ideas and these practices of virtue. Milbank says, hey, you're talking about the church, right? The church needs to go back to being the church, to recognize that once upon a time there was no secular, at least in the way that it's articulated in the modern world. And Milbank's Theology and Social Theory, which is an incredible read, tour de force, he argues that the whole kind of history of sociology is really an attempt to rewrite theology. That theology, for Milbank, is the true social theory. So that brings us to ecclesial ethics, which is really people in the wake of the critiques of McIntyre and Milbank saying, okay, how do we understand constructive ethics in a post-Christian world? Oh, that's covered a lot. And we're right on time here. So Wednesday. Wednesday, you are reading Aquinas on the Virtues and Sam Wells Forming Habits. You'll find Sam Wells a lot easier to read than some of the other stuff that we've been looking at. Okay, great. Okay.